to say or question to ask, but it's great to see everyone. I am really excited about this. I'm excited about the topic we're going to talk about today. I'm excited about the speaker that's going to be speaking to us. You know, the whole topic of Darwinian evolution is, and I suspect, and I don't know about this is not scientific, but I suspect if you took a poll of non-believers and why they don't believe, Darwinian evolution has got to be near the top of the list. And I don't know, Cathryn, you may know that, but anyway, I'm sure it's close to being near the top of the list of reasons people say that they don't believe in God. And, you know, another interesting thing about Darwinian evolution is most people, a large majority of people, view it as settled science. You know, it's viewed as settled science because it's taught as settled science. But I would tell you too that if you go to the top of I'll call it the scientific pyramid, but the leading scientist as far as evolutionary biology are concerned, it is a theory that's in crisis. And this is going to be a fun topic to talk about. We could do a whole series of talks on problems with Darwinian evolution, and I know Cathryn's going to cover a good piece of it tonight. But let me introduce Cathryn. So Cathryn Buse is our speaker tonight. Cathryn is sort of a rocket scientist turned Christian apologist story. She's the author of the book Teaching Others to Defend Christianity, and I would recommend that to any of you. It's a very accessible book, and she has taken like the top 6 arguments from an apologetic standpoint and basically written a chapter on each one where anyone, it doesn't have to be anyone that's an expert in that field, could teach it. They could teach it to a group or learn it themselves, but Teaching Others to Defend Christianity, you can get that on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and I'm sure other book places. Cathryn lives in Decatur, Alabama, which coincidentally is very close to where I grew up. In fact, she and I have we compared notes in terms of just history, and she spent some time working at NASA, and I grew up in a NASA family, so we definitely had some crossover. She has a website that is defendthefaith.com, right, Cathryn?
Defendthefaithministry.com.
Defendthefaithministry.com. So if you're interested in more of Cathryn's work, you know, I would definitely refer you to her website. I would ask you one thing before we get started, Cathryn, and that is, you were a rocket scientist and you became a Christian apologist. There's a story there, right?
Yes, there's always a story, right? Right, there's always a story. Sure, do you want me to go ahead and go into that? Is that kind of my cue?
The virtual floor is yours, Kathy.
Okay.
Thanks for being here.
Okay, well, I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining in, for giving up your evening to sit and listen to me. I appreciate that. So like Mike said, I appreciate the introduction. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, moved to North Alabama and studied engineering. I worked in a couple of DoD programs for a while, Department of Defense missile programs, and then I was working at NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center working on, it was going to be the launch vehicle to replace shuttle. That was a long time ago. I actually left the engineering world when I had my first son. So I've been out of that kind of world for a while, and God has just taken my life in a totally different direction that I never would have anticipated, but it's been such a blessing to kind of follow where he's been leading me. So I became a Christian when I was a young girl, and I grew up in a real godly, strong Christian home. But of course, as I got into high school and started studying some harder science classes, I always had a few friends that like to try to poke and prod at me, you know, questioning, why would you believe in God? And look, we're learning evolution that disproves everything. But I really started facing those kinds of questions in college, and of course then from coworkers. Now there's a lot of people that work at NASA, von Braun himself actually being a man of God, and who were very solid in their faith, that recognize that the science that they're discovering, the science that they see in the observations definitely indicate that there is a creator. And they believe very strongly in God and the God of the Bible, and were amazing, strong Christian men and women that I was around. But there was also a lot of people on the other side and said that science disproves everything. Why would you be so silly and foolish just to believe in a God? We don't need a God. And if there is a God, how can you say it's your God? How can you trust your Bible? It's written by man and it's been changed over time. So I was getting all of those kinds of questions, and it was trying to understand how to engage in those conversations, because I was not doing a very good job of it. I needed to study. And so I started reading and just poring over book after book after book to try to understand, okay, I know this is true, but how do you articulate that to somebody who's coming at it from a different starting point, that has a different base for their worldview conclusions? And how do you break down some of those barriers and have meaningful and fruitful conversations? And from there, I just, I felt called and a passion to teach the next generation. And so at my church, I started teaching the youth, because I saw in them the same clueless teenager that I had been, that here you're raised in church and you understand these things, and you know your Bible, but you don't know how to speak to someone who doesn't believe the Bible. And so I started teaching from there, and it just grew into a book, into a ministry. And here we are several years later. And this is what I love to do still. This is my passion, to go and teach and speak to other believers, to encourage them to have these conversations, to equip them with this information so that they can engage, but also to unbelievers, to try to, again, have those meaningful, fruitful conversations that hopefully do start to break down the walls that we all had before we came to Christ, and just try to help them reason through that. So that's kind of my background. You're going to get a little bit more detail about my experience with NASA, because I think it relates really nicely into this topic about Darwinian evolution. Now, I've taught on a lot of different topics, but I have to say Darwinian evolution is my favorite because it's the one I encountered the most. And so I feel like this is the one that really is probably the least addressed in church, but the most common one that you're going to encounter. And I definitely think that's a big gap that the church leadership needs to start to recognize. And we need to start teaching this to believers, to show them through science how science actually goes right along with scripture. Because if we leave this argument up to the world, they frame this argument as saying it is religion versus science. And that's a flawed way to come at it. It's really bad science versus good science. And when you start looking at good science and following true scientific conclusions and observations and what we know about how the world works, we see everywhere that it supports what we find in scripture. And so it's really important, especially in our culture of skepticism, that we understand that. So with that in mind, that's kind of why when people say, well, what do you want to talk about? I first give a group, well, if there's something pressing that you've seen come up in your group, we'll talk on that. Otherwise, I want to talk about Darwinian evolution. And so especially when I had the chance to connect with Mike Parks here in Chicago. So I am going to kind of poll the audience. So how many of y'all are in Chicago? And I guess I don't have video from a lot of you. So, all right. So I see Bob raised his hand. So I'm guessing there's a few more. Okay. And I don't have your name for you, but I see you raising your hand. So I will say I have been to Chicago one time, and it was several years ago with my children. And I loved it. I love your city. I hope that I can come back there. We just had such a wonderful time. I think I'm a big city girl at heart, but I love the subways and the trains and I just loved being in the city. But I will have to say I had a very difficult experience there. And that was because my husband made me, I'm going to blame him, made me go to the Field Museum. And we walked through the exhibit called The Evolving World. And so the whole thing, and I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if that's a permanent feature at that particular museum or not. But I have to say, when I left, I was very glad that my children were too young to read. We'll put it that way. Oh, it is still there. Thank you. So I really feel this passion for this topic. And then especially when I stop and think about all of the school children, the school field trips, the family vacations that go through that, and the hundreds of thousands of people that walk through those exhibits. And that's not to point out Chicago's museum. That's going to be any museum of natural history that you go through. They're going to continue to be presented with this idea that all of life is explained through Darwinian evolution. And I remember walking into the room that was talking about the dinosaurs, and they had this huge placard on the wall, and it might still be there, but it said, "Engineered for size." And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to phrase that. What does engineering imply? It implies intelligence. And it was about these big monstrous dinosaurs, and it was talking about how they are specially designed. I mean, even think about the terminology they're using for being that size. And so I'm kind of going to pull on that concept a little bit as we go through our talk tonight, because what does that mean when we say engineered for something? If we have engineering involved in biology, this cannot be the result of a blind, random, natural process. So that's what we're going to take a look at. And that's kind of the connection between my experience as an engineer. And I'll explain what type of engineer, because in North Alabama, it's not what do you do, it's what type of engineer are you is the question, because we're all nerdy engineers. But then we'll also make that connection into seeing what does that reveal about when we look at the science and the biology around us. Okay, so I'm going to go back and, oops, I need to be able to share my screen. So Mike, can you toss that ability over to me, please? So I've got some charts for us to look at. Let's see. There we go. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so we'll get started. So we're kind of looking at engineering versus evolution. Now, we need to define our terms up front. And I will be honest, I'll probably not be diligent about this as we get going through, and I will just use the term evolution, which is a broad term. So I'm going to define specifically which type of evolution we're talking about, so that when I use the term evolution, you know I'm actually talking about which type. Okay, so microevolution is going to be evolution on a small scale. So these are going to be, if you remember how we classify organisms, it's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the genus and species are now the smallest level of where we classify living things. And so microevolution is going to be down at the genus and species level. So, and that's also why it's termed speciation. So this does occur. So we do see evolution where things can become a different species, okay? But this is down at the small level. So one example would be drug-resistant bacteria, okay? So they would have some type of mutation to make this particular type of bacteria resistant to a particular drug that we're applying, but it's still bacteria. So there's a different species, but as far as what kind it is, or really, you know, genus level and above, it's still a bacteria. It's still the same type of organism. Okay, but this does occur, all right? And it's very important that we understand our terminologies with this, because oftentimes when someone is talking about evolution, they'll give you an example of microevolution, but then they'll use that to prove the case of macroevolution. Now, what is macroevolution? Well, this is actually Darwin's theory. Okay, so this is saying that we're going to take small scale changes that are then going to be preserved through natural selection, and over a long, slow, gradual process, you can change the entire type of organism. So now this change is going to have to be somewhere above the genus level, so that we're going to move outside of what type of organism you are. This does not occur. It has not been observed. And there's lots of different directions of science and archaeology that we could get into to look at this, but this is what we're going to look at specifically tonight, is this macroevolution idea. So from here on out, when I say evolution, this is what we're talking about, is Darwin's theory of evolution, that these small scale changes from one common ancestor is what evolved over time to develop the entire tree of life of organisms that we see. Okay, now we've defined our evolution terms, but let's also define engineering, because there's lots of different types of engineering. So I was actually a systems engineer. A lot of people want to assume if you work for NASA, then you can tell everything about space and astrophysics, and I'm not an astrophysicist, so I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm actually a systems engineer. So what do we do? Well, it is an interdisciplinary field of engineering that looks at all the aspects of a design to make sure that these things can be incorporated and integrated successfully. Now, that's a lot of big words. What does that mean exactly? It means we make sure all the individual systems can work together. So we're the ones to make sure everyone can play nice with each other. So this is what I did at NASA. Like I said, we were, at the time, we were building the new launch vehicle that was going to replace the shuttle. Obviously, we have moved a lot ahead in that if you were paying any attention to the space exploration. This week, they were about to launch astronauts off of an American launch vehicle that scrubbed yesterday because of all this bad weather we've been having. So, so the program I was on was scrapped many years ago. NASA's always at the whims of who's in the Oval Office, and most of them want to leave their own little stamp on it. So programs change over a lot. But what I did, we were working on what was called the Ares 1 launch vehicle, and NASA. Where we were designing what's called the upper stage. So this is the portion, we had the boosters that were going to get us, you know, up into space, and then those would separate, and the upper stage would carry the vehicle on into wherever it was headed. So we had to do a lot of systems engineering because there's all kinds of systems that have to play well together for this design. So for example, if you have a propulsion line, and it's going to get very cold, and it's running right next to an electrical system that can't be at that temperature, you know, you can't have those overlapping. Or what if the reaction control system and the roll control system needs helium, but the propulsion system isn't aware of that? They need to know to run a line from a helium tank down to that control system. What if they're running, one system needs batteries and the avionics system doesn't know that? The propulsion system needs a valve that has to open and close. Then there's that type of communication and interfaces that takes a lot of engineering and oversight to make sure everyone, they're not building something on top of something else. Okay, so this involves a lot of planning and coordination, making engineers talk to each other, which is not always easy. And so this is what this system engineering is going to do to help get the vehicle integrated for a functional design. Another aspect that I worked on that was probably my favorite part of it was looking at ground transportation. Okay, so we had to consider this vehicle was going to be built in Louisiana, but it's going to launch in Florida. And so we have to get it there. And now when you're building the launch vehicle, you're thinking about what environments is it going to see for just a few hours on the launch pad, and what is it going to experience in space? Well, those are really different from the humidity and the temperatures that's going to be in Louisiana. Plus, if you notice, this is laying on its side. Okay, so now it's in a different orientation than sitting vertical on the launch pad. So are the pressure points the same? How are we going to pick it up and lift it? What is it going to sit on when we transport it? Do we need to cover certain things? Do some things need environmental control? You know, what if we have avionics boxes that cannot endure the humidity for that long as we're shipping it from Louisiana to Florida? So we have to make those considerations and figure out what special things do we need to equip this vehicle to make sure it is still intact and good to go when we get to the launch pad. But then once we get to the launch pad, we have to assemble it. We've got to actually mate it with the rest of the launch vehicle. And then we also have to check out everything. Well, what if we need to change out batteries? Do we have a door there for someone to reach in? Is it on the other side of the vehicle? And that was actually one of the problems that we spent a lot of time working, is they had put a box that was on the opposite side of where the human access point is. And so we were trying to figure out, do we need to put platforms all around there, but now you're standing on top of the dome of a tank to reach in to do this box? How are we going to get over there? So those types of things we had to figure out in order to be able to launch. And then of course, once you get to the launch pad, you have certain services that that the tower has to provide to the vehicle. So it has to fill it with its propellant. It has to drain things out. It has to put gas in, basically, right? It has to check out the avionics system. So we had to make sure that everything going to this plate could reach the plate, that the plate would have all the interfaces that it needed to get all those services from the tower in order to prep it for launch. So this was really probably my favorite part, because it involved a lot of conversations down with Kennedy Space Center. You know, what if the vehicle says, well, we need this particular substance filled into whatever our tanks are, and Kennedy says, well, we don't have that. So you have to have those conversations and coordinate that. So this is systems engineering. All of these things have to be assessed and analyzed and integrated, and we have to go back and forth, right? You couldn't just build a propulsion system and then build a structure. You have to have this iterative process to go back and forth to make sure how you're building the structure accommodates the propulsion, and vice versa. So this is what we spent a lot of time on, and it was really fascinating, and it was a very neat experience. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering, this is really cool, but what does this have to do with evolution? You know, you were promised to talk about Darwin, and now you're getting the stuff about NASA, and what is the connection? Well, here's the connection. Darwin stated in his book on the origin of species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now let's digest that a little bit. What does that mean? What does he mean when he's saying that? Well, his theory is built on the idea that every complex thing has to be built up from something simple. And it has to be built up incrementally with slight, like you said, slight successive modifications all along this path. Now, that means you would have to start with something really simple, and you'd make one change, one small change, and now it's a little bit more complex. And in his mind, this is somehow has to be better than the simpler version. And so natural selection has to preserve this. It has to be more fit to survive so that it can reproduce. And so that the only thing in the population now is this two-part system instead of the one-part system before. But it's going to have a modification, and it's going to acquire another part, making it a little bit more complex. And now this has to be a better fit to survive. It's going to have the survival advantage and pass on its traits of having three parts to the system instead of that simpler two-part system. And so this is how Darwin has to explain everything. And that's why what his quote is so phenomenal. He says, if you could show me a complex organ that can't be built up that way, then my theory falls apart, because everything has to come through that natural blind process that he's ascribing for this macro evolutionary model. Now, when he wrote his book, he actually followed this sentence, right? He's saying, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ exists that's not built up in this small successive modification process, then my theory breaks down. And he says, but I can't find anything like that. Okay, so he follows that sentence by saying there is nothing so complex. Everything can be explained as the slow incremental buildup from something simple. But here's our first question. When did he write this? Does anybody know when he published his work? All right, I know everybody's muted, so everyone's afraid. Yeah, it was in 1859. Okay, so to put that in perspective, this is 2 years before the American Civil War starts. It's also 100 years before DNA is discovered. Okay, so he might have thought there exists no complex organ that can't be explained by his process. But there's a lot that we didn't know back then. Now, I'm giving him a big benefit of the doubt to say that. I would say they actually still knew enough about science to know this should fall apart. But whether he knew at the time or not, what he's given us, though, is a litmus test, right? He's given us a way to test his theory. He said, I think there is nothing complex that cannot be explained in this mechanism, but if there is, this mechanism falls apart. And so now we have what we're looking for. We now know exactly what it's going to take to dismantle this idea. Can we show that something is complex enough that it can't be explained by the slow incremental buildup. Now, here's the connection to my systems engineering experience. Basically, does something in biology require systems engineering? Okay, because when we look at that collection of systems that has to come together and how we have to have intelligence and planning and foresight and design to get it all to work together on that vehicle, if there's an organ or organism or organ system or biological feature that needs that systems engineering, this is what refutes his theory. Okay, so this is what we're looking for. Now we know what to go look for to refute Darwinian evolution. Okay, so I think I kind of talked through some of my slides already without that. So basically, Darwin has assumed that nothing in biology requires systems engineering. Okay, so this is the key. If we can find something that does show systems engineering, something that would be like that launch vehicle, then it can't be formed by those successive slight modifications. His theory breaks down, and there has to be something intelligent responsible for its existence. Remember that big sign at the Field Museum? If they're engineered for their size, engineering requires intelligence and planning. Okay, so we're just going to go through a few examples, and I want you to keep this in mind though. You don't have to memorize all the facts about these examples and know all the detailed biological terms. And you don't have to remember all of them. And because there's hundreds, if not thousands of examples you could pull from, you really only need one, right? Because the moment you need one thing to be engineered, you have to have an intelligent designer. You can't sidestep that. Once something has to be engineered, there has to be an engineer, which implies intelligence. All right, so let's look at the first thing. We're gonna start with just the human body as a whole. Okay, so we're gonna start kind of in the big level, and we're gonna get down really to the really small level too, so you'll have two ends of the spectrum. So the human body actually has 11 different organ systems that have to all function together to keep you alive. So we have the digestive, this only shows 6 of them, but we have the digestive, the endocrine, circulatory, lymphatic, muscular, skeletal, nervous, integumentary, urinary, respiratory, and reproductive systems. Okay, so we've got 11 different systems we have to have to function. Now, each system is going to perform a specific function for the body, but what we're going to walk through is to show how they're all interdependent on one another, that you can't really have one system operating in isolation. It requires all of them. For one example, we're going to look just at the circulatory system. Okay, now this system, of course, is very important because this includes your heart and your veins and your arteries and the capillaries and all of your red and white blood cells and your platelets that have to be circulated throughout your body. So the point of this is that they're taking oxygen-rich blood to the rest of your body so that your cells can do work. And then once that oxygen has been used, it's going to return the oxygen-depleted blood cells back into the bloodstream to repeat the cycle. Okay, so clearly we can't do this alone because what is bringing in the oxygen? Well, this is why we're dependent on the respiratory system. So we need something to bring in the oxygen from the outside air to replenish that oxygen in our blood cells. And so actually, if you look down into the lungs, there's these tiny little air sacs called alveoli that are wrapped around the blood vessels, and that's where we're getting this oxygen exchange. So it's putting the oxygen into the blood, and then when it comes back from doing its work, it's sending out the carbon dioxide and water to then be breathed out through the respiratory system. So obviously these are very interdependent. But it goes further than that because neither one of these systems are going to work if we don't have a nervous system. So we have to have a brain with our spinal cord and the nerve endings to actually move these things, to actually tell you to breathe. So there's a region in your brain called the hypothalamus that deals with all those autonomic functions, which are those functions we do without having to think about them, which is breathing and your heart beating and your stomach digesting food. So your brain, that part of your brain is having to work in order to keep these things moving. So we're dependent on that nervous system. We're also dependent on the muscular system because our heart, after all, is a type of muscle. It's a very specific type of muscle fiber and muscle cell that allows that type of contractive force to actually pump the blood through. But we're also dependent on the skeletal system It's inside the bone marrow that is making the red and white blood cells in your platelets. So we can't have a circulatory system without our skeletal system, because that's what's producing the blood to go through the rest of your body. Of course, then we're also dependent on the urinary system. The job of your kidneys is to filter your blood. So it's filtering out the waste products from your bloodstream and returning back good, clean, healthy blood, and then eliminating the waste. And so we couldn't have a circulatory system if we didn't have something that's cleaning and filtering out the blood. And we are even connected to the endocrine system because you have your adrenal gland, which is sending hormones, messages through your body when you need to, that's your kind of fight or flight. If your body senses you might need to run away quickly, it starts increasing your heart rate and your breathing rate to accommodate a quick escape, if you will. But we're also dependent on your pancreas, because that is including glands that, or the hormones that regulate your blood sugar levels in your blood. So, right, we couldn't have that out of whack. So we need our pancreas working. So we're dependent on all of these systems. So it's like we understand that our body's dependent on our blood getting everywhere, but our blood getting everywhere is dependent on everything else in our body. We can't do any of these things independently. And so this right here is the epitome of systems engineering design. Look at all of these different systems. You could almost consider that you have the skeletal system is your structural system, and your circulatory system is your main propulsion system, and your nervous system is your avionic system telling your body what to do. We have to make sure that all of these are getting the right things from one another in the right quantities at the right time in the right locations. So all of this involves system engineering. We cannot explain those body systems working in that integrated fashion by Darwin's explanation. We can't have the slight, numerous, successive modifications building up to these systems. They all have to be there at the same time, fully functional in the correct way and integrated together. You couldn't have, well, let's just work on the skeletal system and then eventually we'll develop the circulatory system. It doesn't work that way. You have to have all of these things integrated together in order for it to function. So to me, this is a very easy to go to example, because we all have this rough idea, understanding of how our body systems work together. So this could be a really simple way, if you're talking to a friend, to explain this requires systems engineering. It's no different from designing a launch vehicle, that you need all of those parts working together at the same time. Now, I promised you we'd get down even further into the details than that. And so we're going to look now at the cells. The cell is the basic building block of all living things. So there's no living thing that doesn't have a cell. So it's very critical that we understand these in their right context. Now, Darwinists claim that life began with a, quote, simple cell, whose complexity then eventually increased to where you have what he calls the complex cell. And remember, it has to work that way for his theory to hold up. So we have the prokaryotic cell, which is this one here on the left, and then we have the eukaryotic cell. Now, even though they've been drawn at the same size, that's in this representation, the prokaryotic cell is much, much, much smaller, like orders of magnitude smaller than the eukaryote. The prokaryote, though, is simpler than the eukaryotic cell. And so this is where Darwin says, well, we're going to start with what he's calling the simple cell, and we're going to increase its complexity to the complex cell. Now, there's only two types of organisms that have this prokaryotic cell. It's a bacteria and an archaea bacteria cell. And so they're unicellular organisms. So obviously they are very simple. When we kind of look at the difference here, the prokaryote has, it does not have a membrane-bound nucleus the way the eukaryote does. It just has a little, they call it a nucleoid region, which is kind of where the DNA hangs out. And it doesn't have all these different organelles that the eukaryote has. Now, it does still have ribosomes, okay? Now, there's even one educational video that I came across and kind of pulling some of this together. It's a video that I found on a high school's website, okay? that says prokaryotic cells are the simplest and most ancient type of cell. They were the only form of life on Earth for billions of years before eventually giving rise to the eukaryotic cell. The reason they gave is that the prokaryotes are a lot smaller and have a simpler structure. Okay, now that's true. The prokaryote is a lot smaller. It does have a simpler structure, but is it truly simple? Because that's what Darwin has to start with, is something simple, not simpler. Okay, when we look at that in context of just, does size equal complexity? Not necessarily. Is the flea not complex only because it's smaller than the dog? Or are they equally complex? Okay, so just because something is smaller and maybe simpler does not mean that it's simple in the way that Darwin needs it for what he needs as his first cell to start with. Okay, because even though this prokaryotic cell does look simpler than the eukaryotic cell, it has a lot of stuff to it. Okay, it still has DNA. It has some type of mobility structure. So it has a flagellum or this kind of hairy stuff on the outside, which is the cilia. And it has a cell membrane. It also still has ribosomes. It still has cytoplasm, which is kind of the goo that all of that stuff sits in. And it has a cytoskeleton, which kind of holds those things in their general place. So we still have a lot of features here that have to come together in order for this, quote, simple cell to exist. And while it is simpler than the eukaryote, this is still pretty complex. Okay, so we're going to look at the systems engineering that would be involved in just this prokaryotic cell. Okay, and we're going to start with its flagellum, because you'll see not only does it need all of these components, but each of these components needs many components to go along with it. So this is a zoomed in picture of the flagellum for the bacteria. And if you notice the structure of it, even though most textbooks describe it as just a whip-like appendage, that really doesn't do it justice, because we start to get an image in our mind that it's just this piece of string that hangs off at the end, but it's actually a rotary engine. Look at how they've described this. We've got L rings and rods and P rings, and it's got this filament that comes out the cell wall. It has stators. It even has this a secretion system to basically keep it lubricated. And how it works is it streams a flow of protons across the cell membrane. And as it can vary its speed based on the speed of how those protons are flowing. But what is so cool is it can instantaneously change directions by instantly switching the direction of that proton flow. That's something our engines can't do, right? We can't immediately change directions of our engine without breaking it. There's even a protein in here that acts as basically like a clutch to kind of disengage the flagellum so that it can stop exactly where it is. So when you look at all of this, this is a miniature engine. And we would know an engine requires intelligence and engineering and planning and detail and design and intent. And so if we know that a man-made engine requires all that, and these have the same type of components, only more efficient and higher quality basically than what we could come up with, we know there has to be some sort of designer behind this, because Darwin is going to have to explain a fully functional flagellum with only one of these components and all the rest of them missing. And then generations later, acquiring another component with all the rest of them missing, but the flagellum still working. And we see that we cannot do that. You can't build an engine like that, just one part sitting there and it work, and then just throw another part together and it still work. Your engine is not going to work until you have all those components in place, sized appropriately, co-located in the right way, assembled in the right way, right? Because it still wouldn't do us any good if we had all those components, but nothing was integrated. So it takes all of that to show that we can't even have that whip-like appendage that we make it sound so simple and easy sticking out of the back of the bacteria, unless you have all of this design and engineering underneath. Okay, so that's just the flagellum. Let's take a look at the cell membrane. Okay, the cell membrane is also difficult to explain because it is an intricate designed feature as well. And what's really fascinating about the cell membrane is if Darwin's theory is correct, he's going to have this real simple cell that has this particular structure for a membrane. And we're just going to increase the complexity of the cell. And so the more complex cell should have the same structure of a membrane, the same structural components. But what they've observed is that not only is the membrane of a prokaryote completely different from a eukaryote, the two types of prokaryotes have different structures for their membranes. And so even Darwin-minded scientists have said, well, the two prokaryotes have to come from a different ancestor themselves, which is kind of driving back this evolutionary progression even further into the past and having to hypothetically create some sort of ancestor to the two prokaryotes. So it tells us these couldn't have evolved into the eukaryote if they're all using different structures, okay? Now, even though, like I said, the prokaryote is simpler than the eukaryote, it still has something that Darwin has a really difficult time explaining, and that's DNA. Okay, the prokaryote still has to have DNA. Even the quote, simple archaeal cell has between 500,000 and 5.7 million base pairs in its DNA, okay? That's coded information, and this information has to be accurate. It can't just be data floating around. It's actually informing the cell of what to go do, what proteins to go make, when to reproduce, when to replicate and split and divide. And so Darwin has to explain, how are we going to get information from nothing? And that's not possible. You can't just wake up one day and decide you want to be a brain surgeon. You have to have some information from some intelligent source explain to you what it takes to be a brain surgeon. And so here we have DNA that's information that requires intelligence, but it's written in code. And we know there's no way we can get a code out of chaos. In fact, there's E.H. Andrews, he's a professor of materials at the University of London, has a phenomenal quote about that we cannot get codes out of chaos. A coded information has to come from the working of an intelligent mind. And so even though this looks like the simplest thing that we could come up with, we still have to have DNA. And there still has to be some kind of explanation of where this came from. So the big problem then is if we're going to start with a true simple cell, it has to be a cell that does not have a flagella, that does not have the cilia, that doesn't have a cell membrane, that doesn't have DNA, and that doesn't have ribosomes. We would have to break it down to one component, because that is the simplest thing, would be one component. But we can't have a cell without a membrane and without DNA and without some way for it to move and avoid being eaten. Some way to produce proteins, which is where those ribosomes come from. So we can't have a cell functional without all of these components, which says somebody had to do the systems engineering and put all of those things together so that it can work and work well, right? It has to be able to reproduce. So it has to work efficiently in order to generate a second generation. And so Darwin would have to say, well, let's start with one that maybe has no DNA information, and that gradually, by numerous slight successive modifications, gets a little bit more information, but still not complete information. But you can't have a second cell without all of the correct DNA in place at one time. Okay. So furthermore, let's walk through this hypothetical though. If we were going to start with the prokaryote and eventually evolve into the eukaryote, let's just think about what would that look like? What kind of steps would you have to go through? And we're going to have to take one small step at a time, because we can't change a whole bunch at one time, because that's not Darwin's theory, right? That would look like creation if all of a sudden one organism completely changed into another over one generation. That's not what Darwin was postulating. So if we try to hypothetically create this evolutionary path, we have to think about what all has to change to get from the prokaryote to the eukaryote. Well, we need a membrane-bound nucleus, right? We've got to somehow wrap up that little DNA that just floats in here in that one little region and put a membrane around it. But what if we did that before the cell knew how to send the DNA out, or before it had RNA? Because the DNA can't leave the nucleus. So it needs other structures and pores through that membrane for RNA to replicate the DNA, and the RNA leaves, right? The DNA doesn't leave the nucleus. So what if it doesn't have that capability yet? Now you just have DNA trapped inside and it can't replicate. It needs to increase in size, right? We said this was much, much, much smaller. Well, what if it increases in size, but it doesn't get mitochondria yet, which is the energy storehouse for the cell? It's not going to have enough energy for it to move around and still function if it's increased its size but doesn't have mitochondria. But if it gets the mitochondria first, what is it going to do with all this extra energy when it's still this teeny tiny microscopic, much, much smaller cell than the eukaryote? And what about all of these membrane-bound organelles? Of course, the cell membrane has to change because we said that's even got a different structure. So we have to start thinking about, okay, which change would come first? And this is where Darwin's theory starts to really fall apart when you look down at the details. We have a phrase that we say, the devil's in the details. I think it's quite the opposite with evolution. To me, when you look at the details, it's when evolution wants to brush it with this broad stroke of, well, it evolved and adapted. It sounds like it might work. But when you look down in the details, that's when you see this is a thumbprint of God. This can't work through a natural, blind, random process of slight successive modifications. So to me, God is in the level of the details. And it's really the devil's idea that brushes it with this broad stroke of, oh, it just evolved. Well, let's look at it. Hypothetically, how would we ever get from this prokaryotic cell to the eukaryotic cell? One step at a time. And every step has to be more advantageous for the cell. It has to survive and it has to reproduce. And we start to see that we can't incrementally make changes to this cell type to actually get to this one. Because the basic design of the cell system is essentially the same in all living things. Even this little bacteria needs a membrane. It needs DNA. It needs ribosomes. It has to make proteins. And so we can't find a, quote, simple cell to start with that doesn't have all of these complex mechanisms to it. Now, I'm going to throw this out there because I think it's an interesting comparison to this idea that we've talked about of how we're going to incrementally change between cell types. And there was an article in the year 2014 by Duke University professor of mechanical engineering, it pains me to say that, Cathryn Buse. And he published an article called The Evolution of Airplanes. Okay, and this is what he was postulating. He said, well, we can see an evolution in technology because we can see how, let me go back. We can see how planes have progressed over time, right? If we start with the Wright brothers plane, and we see over time, we can eventually increase complexity and capability and efficiency. We end up with a Boeing 747. He makes the analogy that this is how life evolved, okay? But could these planes have evolved in that mindset of a slight successive modification, slowly, gradually, over a long period of time? Could we have taken the Wright brothers plane and swapped out just the engine and it still be able to fly? Absolutely not, because you're going to need intelligence and engineering and systems engineering to make sure that you change everything else. If you put on a more powerful engine, but you don't change anything about the structure or the cockpit or the landing gear or the fueling system, you don't have a functional plane. So you have to still do systems engineering to make this next leap to the next complex level of airplane. So yes, this plane here is more complex than the previous one, but this was not by random accumulations of slight successive modifications. This was intelligence and planning and engineering involved to make sure that everything changed in the appropriate way so that the whole thing can still be functional. And this ties back because when Darwin said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And we've looked at just a few examples that show we have to have an engineering mindset to come up with the basic building block of all life, to have DNA, to have even the flagellum on the bacteria, to have our organ systems working together. And so we've shown several ideas, several organs and organisms and biological features that require that could not be explained in this way. And so his theory absolutely has to break down because it does not adequately explain the complexity of life that we see. So at that point, so that was kind of what I had to present. I hope, and that is the hard part about Zoom, because everybody needs to mute, so there's not a whole lot of background noise, but I don't get any feedback as I'm talking through, so I feel like it's just a monologue. But I hope that that made sense. Please, this is your opportunity to unmute and ask any questions. We'll go back and talk about anything else that you've encountered and wondered about Darwinian evolution, even if we didn't talk about it now, is fair game. So I'll yield the floor to the audience.
Awesome, thank you. So we got a chat question. Can you see the chat questions?
I can, let's see. All right, I hear you on rejecting macro. I'm doubting many examples of micro. Okay. Yes, finches. Yes, excellent point. Yes, there are a lot of examples that people give that are microevolution, Darwin's finches included. One of my other examples that I'm just repulsed by is the peppered moth. And I remember studying that in high school. I don't know if that's something that y'all are familiar with either, but to me, these aren't necessarily microevolution. These are just variation that already exist in their genetic code. And so I agree. I think that God made lots of different finches, and why not? He made lots of different people, right? We look differently, but we're all still people. And I find that frustrating sometimes when we look at how he's describing and classifying the finches as, you know, well, these are a little bit larger, these have a different coloration, these have different beak sizes. And you could almost make that same translation to people. We're all different sizes. We have different shapes to our faces and to our facial features, different shapes, eyes and nose and mouth, different coloration, different skin tone and hair texture. And so to me, I find that more comparable, that this is variation within our genetics, but people have not micro evolved into other people, but we are just then expressing different variations. And especially when you look at, I don't know, if you go through a Punnett square type thing, when you look at a population of just recessive and dominant genes, and you kind of go through that process, I see a lot of the micro evolution examples are more just variation within a species instead of them evolving into a different species. But,
Yeah,
so
Cathryn,
I'm with you.
I might just add one thing to that too. And I don't remember who did the study, but there was an extrapolation of the finches and the longer beaks and shorter beaks, and what happens is when the rains come back, then the finches adjust to the weather pattern. So they were longer when the ground was dry. They returned to what was the normal length under normal weather conditions.
Right. And even that sometimes can get confusing, just how we casually talk about it, because we say it goes back to, and it almost implies, well, they're evolving each time, instead of just that particular phenotype is being expressed in more in the population than the other, which to me is a lot of that peppered moth. And I'll just briefly explain that in case some of you aren't familiar with the peppered moth, because I think it's the same type of example, really, that they're light colored pepper moths and there's dark colored pepper moths. And so they observed that in London pre-industrial revolution, there were a lot more light colored pepper moths because they blended in with the trees. And then post-industrial revolution, when there's soot everywhere, the dark peppered moths, their numbers grew, right? They were a bigger part of the population than the light ones, because now they blend in more from birds trying to eat them. They blend in more on the soot-covered trees. That is just, the population still had white and dark and light pepper colored moths. They didn't evolve into each other. They didn't adapt and change into each other, but now the dark ones are able to reproduce more when they're more hidden. So that's going to be expressed more. So this is now like what Mike was pointing out with the finches, an environmental change that is going to yield a different amount of the population that's present, but they're not they're not evolving into each other. So I think we have to be careful how we, I don't know, you almost have to pull back when we use the word adapted and evolved versus just an expression of the population based on that environmental change. Let's see. So any other questions on that one? Because I was going to jump to the next one. I see another question on here, but I don't want to leave that behind if somebody else had another comment. Okay. So Bob W says, do you include anything in your talk about the Cambrian explosion? I have not in this talk, obviously, but that's one of my next favorite topics to get onto, because I've been asked a lot, you know, how would you, what would you say to refute evolution? And I would use 4 words. To me, I could dismantle it in 4 words. The first one is irreducible complexity, which is really what we talked about tonight. I didn't use that term because I was kind of tying it to the idea of engineering, but you can swap out systems engineering for irreducible complexity. Because it really is getting at the same idea that there's a system that's too complex. It can't be broken down into simpler components. It needs all of those pieces working together at the same time, which is that systems engineering idea. But my other 2 words would be Cambrian explosion, because to me it is that big of a nail in the coffin or should be, for Darwinian evolution. And mostly because later in Darwin's book, he gives us another quote, or another way to test his theory. And he's basically saying, if we can't find any transitional species, or basically if we find different body plans all showing up in the rocks, right, in the fossil record, fully formed and all at the same time, then that kind of blows apart his theory as well. Because his theory needs these small, slight incremental steps over time. And so we would have to see all of these transitional species. But the Cambrian explosion, it's called that because it's the Cambrian rock layer, which is what scientists would say would be the oldest layer of rock that we have. Then there's pre-Cambrian, but really the oldest one that we've found fossils in. That there's, if they think that whole layer took, and I'm rusty on the numbers, like 50 billion years, or I guess 100 billion years or something to complete, the Cambrian explosion level would be like 1 billion. Okay, so it's just a very, very small part of that entire rock layer where they found 23, 26 different phylum. Okay, so think again with our categories of life, we have domain, kingdom, phylum. Okay, so that's pretty high of different types of organisms. We found those fossils showing up fully formed, completely different from one another, all at the same time, which means you would find, of course, they are extinct organisms, but just to kind of put it for you in a way that you can visualize it, if you're not familiar with the Cambrian explosion, it would be like finding a snake fossil next to a frog, next to a bird, next to a rabbit, next to a human, right? Very different body plans, all showing up at the same time in the dirt, in the fossil record. And this directly refutes what we should be seeing if Darwin's theory were true. So yes, so that's kind of a really quick, probably bad summation, explanation of the Cambrian explosion. But if you've not heard of that and you're interested in really understanding how to talk Darwinian evolution with somebody who is a Darwinist, definitely go back and study that, because it's a very powerful argument. Let's see, do I know anything about genetic entropy? Actually, I gave this similar talk last week, and there is a lady online who was holding up a book called Genetic Entropy, and she had plugged it several times that it was a wonderful book to read through this. And so this is the idea that as things mutate, it actually loses information. And there was an article that I actually read yesterday or this morning, I think, that was talking about that even it was even a Darwinist was agreeing that yes, as things mutate, it's actually removing information from the genetic code. For Darwin's theory to work, mutations need to be beneficial, which is a huge problem in itself, but also they need to be adding information so that you gain new features, new organs, new organ systems if you're going to progress into a more complex or different type of organism. But that's not what happens when we have a mutation. It's always losing information. And so the idea is, as you do that time and time again, you're just continuing to decrease what you're finding in your genetic code.
Cathryn, just to add on to that, mutations almost always cause devolution. That, like
Yes.
you said, it's the opposite of evolution. And the example that I've seen people use is, imagine a software program like Microsoft Word, and it's a complex software program, but let it randomly change characters in the program, and what do you think is going to happen to it? Well, it's not going to improve, right? And I think that's a pretty fair analogy.
Yes. And I think that's a perfect analogy when we stop and think about that genetic code. That's the code. I don't know if any of you have had to take a computer programming class. I took one in college, and it was as miserable as it sounds. and it was very difficult because you make one little mistake, and you add a comma at the end of a line when there shouldn't be, and it's wrecked. It doesn't do anything. It won't compile. And so it takes a lot of planning and we would never, look at our phones as what they can do and say, it just kind of fell into place like that. It takes so much intelligence and planning to put something in code. And so that's exactly what we see with our DNA. Okay, so Bob let's see, most evolutionists say humans evolved from a population of around 10,000. Genetic scars with apes. Now, I probably can't speak to that very well because I'm not familiar with some of that.
Hey, Bob, can you unmute? Bob Clapper?
I'm unmuted.
Okay, good. So Cathryn, Bob is the area director for Reasons to Believe. And I think there's probably this is probably a disagreement that would fall between Reasons to Believe and the BioLogos organization. Bob, am I right about that? You could shed some light on that, because I'm sure you know what Fuzz Rana probably would say about that.
You said it correctly. It's a big disagreement between people who are evolutionists, evolutionary creationists, or and which is represented by BioLogos, and I follow some of what their teaching is, and I have a hard time reconciling it because in a sense they deny the existence of original Adam and Eve and stuff. And so, but one of their two biggest arguments is that they say that humans have evolved from a population of about 10,000. If we look at our diversity today, it had to evolve from a population of 10,000 individuals. Now that number fluctuates sometimes. And then they talk about all these genetic scars that exist in, there are non-functional, but we have in common with apes. And they said this must be indicative that we have a common ancestor with, that apes and humans have a common ancestor with something in the very far past. And I guess I'm looking a little bit for some more answers to these kind of concerns.
Okay, so I'll do my best. I probably don't have all the details that could address that right in front of me, so I might be a little fuzzy on some of how I answer this question. To me, it goes back to refuting the full concept of evolution itself, of macroevolution, because to me, when that theory falls apart, it takes off the table human evolution as well, right? That we were uniquely formed by a creator, just like everything else had to have been uniquely created and designed by an intelligent creator. Because to me, when you're talking about, well, we can walk through, there is no hypothetical way to get from a reptile to a bird, because the bird has so many unique features about it that make it uniquely bird, that we could not have incrementally stepped through that. That to me shows that every kind of organism was uniquely created. I mean, that really even goes back to what the Cambrian explosion shows, that they all showed up right at the same time, fully formed and unique, not blurring into one another, coming from a common ancestor. So to me, when you refute that, that inherently refutes that humans evolved from apes. Now, if you go and look at a lot of the skeletal features that are so different between apes and humans, so if we were to look just at how their skeleton would have to change to get to our skeleton, that to me is a similar walk of, we could not get from the prokaryote to the eukaryote with a slight successive modification and it be a better surviving and reproducible organism in all those interim steps, which it would have to be for human evolution to be true. So my first thing would be going back to pulling evolution off the table completely. And I think once we do that, we can have a clearer understanding of what the first population would have to be. I think so I've also, I alluded to, I had a real crazy career path. When I left NASA, I stayed home with my kids, and this was kind of where the teaching and the book really, that's when it got published, was when I was home with the kids. But since then, I've been teaching upper level math. So I taught AP Calculus for a couple of years and pre-calculus, and now I'm homeschooling my kids. So it's all over the place. But to me, when you look at the population growth, just using an exponential growth equation with very conservative numbers, if you say we start with 10,000 people 10,000 years ago, we would need orders upon orders upon orders of magnitude more people on Earth today than what we have. I don't think the numbers mathematically support this idea. So to me, it's Cambrian explosion and math that says that this is what I would do with those types of claims.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, Cathryn, and just lack of evidence for the evolution from one animal type to another animal type.
Right.
You know, so just for everyone's benefit too, the organization that proposes that, BioLogos, and Bob, you know more about that than way more than I do, but they are an organization that they're a Christian organization, but their belief is that God directed the evolutionary process. So they don't it's not a naturalistic belief, but it's, I guess they don't like the term theistic evolution, but that's, I think that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Bob, did I do that fair enough?
You did. And the founder, Francis Collin, was a big name in the Human Genome Project. And he was just awarded the Templeton Prize. He's no longer connected with BioLogos. Someone else heads it up right now. But there, you described it pretty accurately.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm gonna answer these out of order. So I'm not ignoring your question, Thor, but I'm gonna jump to what Bob had asked about the Cambrian explosion, just because we had just talked about that briefly. He did know about the Cambrian explosion, and this is where I may try to give him some benefit of the doubt with not knowing what DNA actually looks like and the details of some of the biological systems that we have, but he did know about the Cambrian explosion, and so I can't be so kind and give him a pass on that, because actually the first people that were really protesting, if that's probably not the right word because we have a different idea of protesting these days, but that were really against his idea were the paleontologists or the archaeologists, because they knew about the Cambrian explosion. And so there are some really incredible quotes from people that he had worked with. One gentleman, his name is Agassiz. Darwin actually sent him kind of like a proof text of his book before it was published, to try to get him on board, because he was an archaeologist and he was like, this is ridiculous. This goes completely against everything that we're seeing when we dig in the fossils. And so it was really the fossil record and those people that understood what they were finding when they dug in the dirt that were the biggest opponents to his theory from the beginning. So I don't know how to explain that. He knew about that. He had gotten pushback on that, but he went forward with his idea anyway. So, and honestly, if you read through his book, sometimes his quotes do leave that door open that maybe he wasn't completely convinced, where he said, this might present a problem. I don't know how to answer this question. But then he has other quotes where he's like, I really don't care what the evidence says. I'm sticking with it. So it's hard to, that one's hard to balance out. Okay, so now to jump back to what Thor was asking. So if Homo sapiens are part of an evolution process and the earth is evolving, how do you accommodate climate control and keep the balance of nature in check? So who's in charge, God or man? That's an interesting question. Now, so I will have to, as I give this answer, I'll give a little exception here. I don't think that we're part of an evolutionary process. So I will kind of disagree on that one. But as far as who's in control, God or man, I think that's a great question, because it looks like we're killing our own planet, but then we know that God is sovereign and he's in control. So how do we reconcile that? I think really when we go back and look at scripture, we know that when God formed man, he put man in charge of everything. And he said, have dominion, right? He said, tend the garden. So that was, one of Adam's first roles was to take care of the garden. He said, name the animals. And when you're given the authority to name something, that means you have authority over that thing, right? When you name your children, you're kind of declaring, I now have authority over you. When you look at in ancient empires, when Nebuchadnezzar, right, took the Jews back to Babylon and he renamed them because he's saying, I'm in charge of you now. When God called Abram, he renamed him because he said, I'm now in authority over you. So the naming process itself also shows that man is going to be put in authority over animals and over what God made, right? You can kind of see the creation as God made everything, preparing it for man's arrival, and then he placed man in the garden and said, here is what all I've made for you. Be fruitful and multiply and care for it, right? So we were supposed to take care of it. But as man being the head of creation, just like if you're the head of your household or the head of a nation, what that person does affects everyone that's under his dominion. So when Adam and Eve sinned, as the head, so to speak, of creation, when they broke that, everything under them broke as well. So everything drastically changed. We see that with Noah, right? When God said in the days of Noah that everyone was so wicked, everything is going to be destroyed, right? God said, I'm going to destroy everything that has a breath of life. Nothing will survive except for what I put in the ark. And so he saved the righteous, and all of creation was going to fall with the wickedness of man, but part of creation was going to be saved along with the righteous, right? He put all the animals on the ark to start again. And so creation is going to rise and fall as man does. But just like we can't save ourselves, we can't actually save and redeem creation. It takes God to come down and redeem mankind. So it's going to take God to come down and redeem creation. Now, that doesn't mean we're to go about destroying it. We are supposed to take care of it. Just like you care for your children, you have dominion and authority over your children. That doesn't mean you destroy them for your own selfish purposes. Of course, we're struggling with that in this country as well. But we should care for that. So we should take care of the earth, but we can't fix the earth any more than we could fix our own sin issue. So that's kind of how I approach that issue of the climate control. Who's in control? God is in control, but we are to be good stewards of what he's given us, but we can't restore it. That's going to have to happen when God comes back, right? And God will, when Jesus returns, he will destroy everything in his fire judgment and then restore everything with a new heaven and a new earth. So.
Good answer.
Thank you. All right, so let's see. Okay. Well, thank you, Emma, for listening in. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry, I was reading the
I was
next
going to
comment.
ask, does anyone else have any questions? And feel free just to unmute and ask a question. But if not, I'll just add just a couple of comments. And Cathryn talked about the information as one of the elements that is indicative that we did not come from an evolved process, and I just find that so interesting. And every one of our cells, and we've got trillions of cells, estimated between 10 and 100 trillion cells in our body. Every one of our cells has the equivalent information of 1.5 gigabytes. So, and 1.5 gigabytes equals about 500,000 pages, single spaced, of regular text, and that's in every cell. And go back to what Darwin called the simple single cell, which he didn't have the technology we have in 1859, but that information, and it's immaterial, it's not the DNA. The information itself is immaterial, just like the information in a book. The book is not the information, it's an immaterial part of it. That immaterial information had to come from somewhere for the very first cell, whatever that was. And there's only one place that we know that structured information of that complexity comes from, and that's from a mind. And so, I mean, it's just one more of many discussions that are indicative of why Darwinian evolution is really a theory in crisis. But Cathryn, thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your talk. I'd love to have you back on other topics. We talked about that before the meeting. I wanted to before we close, I wanted to let you all know, and I just got this today, but the gentleman that wrote the book, The Bedrock of Christianity, his name is Justin Bass. I spoke with him this afternoon. This is an outstanding book, by the way. So it's a study of the resurrection. He is going to speak to our group June the 12th, and we had to work around his schedule and mine. So this is going to be, maybe more people will watch it recorded than live, but it's going to be like a midday during the week kind of a session. So I'll send information out, but 11 o'clock on June the 12th is when we'll have Justin speaking, and that'll be our next meeting. So if no one else has anything else, thank you again, Cathryn. We will definitely.
Thank you for having me. Yes, well, I'd love to be back. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for
Thank you.
tuning in. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good evening.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Cathryn. Bye-bye.
Bye.